Welcome everybody to the penultimate event of the Cycle Touring Festival 2021. Very exciting. We've only got one session left after this one. Convening a panel to discuss the ethics of cycle touring might seem like a bit of a heavy topic for a Sunday afternoon, but it covers lots of issues which crop up again and again at the festival. And I think it's really important that we address these things head on, as do all my panelists. This year, actually, more than ever, when the world is reeling from the shock of the coronavirus epidemic and normal life has been put on hold, I think we've been given a really unique opportunity to build back better, to take a long, hard look at how we've been doing things in the past and how we might do things in the future when normal service resumes. From the environmental impact of the bike you ride and the mode of travel that you choose when not on the bike, to cycling through conflict zones and poverty tourism. There are so many different aspects to the idea of travelling responsibly. And we're so lucky this afternoon to be joined by three experts in their respective fields. They're all utter forces of nature. And if anyone can help us answer these tricky questions, it's them. So I'll introduce you to them all very briefly. So first up, we've got Isla Rowntree. I'm sure many of you will have heard of Isla Bikes. Isla is the incredible person behind Isla Bikes, which, as anyone with small people in their lives will know, is the gold standard for children's bikes. They're high quality and lightweight, and they're designed with sustainability at the forefront, really. Everything about them is about sustainability. They're designed to last. She's also founded the Imagine project whilst at Isla Bikes, which uses ideas of the circular economy, which hopefully she'll explain a bit about. And the idea is to create bikes which are rented out to users, and at the end of their working life they can be broken down and all the materials reused rather than going into landfill. I believe, Isla will correct me if I'm wrong, but it's been put on hold at the moment, and it'll be interesting to get Isla's thoughts about that and about why and what the implications of that are. We're also joined by Kate Rawles. Dr. Rawls is a former lecturer in environmental philosophy and now runs Outdoor Philosophy, which explores big questions about human and nature relations, particularly through outdoor activities and adventure travel. She rode across North America back in 2006, interviewing people to explore attitudes to climate change, which she wrote up in a very good book called The Carbon Cycle. Highly recommended if you've not already read it. She's currently writing another book about her life cycle journey, during which she cycled from Colombia to Cape Horn by bamboo bike, exploring biodiversity loss. And I can't wait for that book to be finished so I can give that one a read as well. And then finally, we've got Julian Sierra. So you may have seen Julian's session yesterday talking to Kate about his experiences cycling across Israel and Palestine, which he wrote up in his latest book, 50 Miles Wide, another book I would really highly recommend. He's written a number of other books which cover everything from globalization in the context of his own world record-breaking ride around the world to his experiences in London as a cycle courier. And he's also contributed lots of articles to The Guardian, The New Statesman and other publications. Somebody in the talk yesterday suggested that Julian should be running the Labour Party. So he's certainly quite a political chap. He describes his writing as roadside politics, and I think that sums it up really well. He looks at global issues from the seat of a bike, which gives him a wonderfully unique perspective. So I started getting onto the panelists, enough of me talking. I started by talking about the current pandemic and how normal life is on pause at the moment. People keep talking about the need to build back better, which I take to mean coming up with a more sustainable model of living, where living the good life isn't about owning more stuff and endless consumption. Sorry, talk more slower, I'll try. I talk fast because my brain's always going. So yeah, which I take to mean coming up with a more sustainable model of living, where living the good life is no longer about owning more stuff and endless consumption, but you might, of course, have other thoughts about what the future should look like. Whatever the future does hold post-pandemic, what role do you think the bicycle can play, specifically in the context of cycle touring? So Kate, do you want to tackle that gem of a question first?
Sure, by all means. Thanks, Laura. I mean, I think you kind of nailed it when you said earlier on in your introduction that however horrific the pandemic has been, and none of us, I'm sure, are here to deny that, it has given us probably a unique and fantastically valuable opportunity to rethink what we mean by living a good life and what we all value in terms of our quality of life and how we think society should be going forward. And one thing we know for sure is that building back better can't mean building back as it was before, because the way things were before were utterly unsustainable in a way that is actually really hard to comprehend, and I work on this stuff. So WWF a few years ago came out with this report where they said, if everybody on the earth lived the lifestyle of an average European, i.e. lived like we do, we would need 3 planets. So we're leading lives which are 3 times more heavy in terms of stuff and consumerism than the planet literally can bear. literally can bear. And the side effect of all that is the global climate change emergency and the ecological emergency, where we're losing millions of species and we're looking at an ecological catastrophe with the breakdown of our major ecological systems on which we depend for minor things like fresh air, clean water, fertile soil, etc., etc. So it's hard to overstate the importance of this question, Laura, actually. Building back better has to mean building back differently from the way it was pre-pandemic. And I think we've all had a chance during the pandemic to think, well, what do I actually value? And I don't think many of us have come up with the answer, more stuff. Actually, we've loved the opportunity to get out on our bikes and have roads empty of traffic and it be safe to take our kids. How many people have talked about how amazing it's been to be able to hear birds and to be able to get outside? So I think the bicycle comes in a literal way because it does offer us a chance to have a much, much more sustainable transport infrastructure. I mean, if we have more people on bikes, there are so many win-wins in terms of reduction of carbon, reduction of air pollution. We've seen these horrible figures about how many deaths are actually related to air pollution caused to traffic. It's a big, big number, big, big number. Of course, there are wins in terms of health and quality of life as well. So I think the bike as a method of transport, the importance and the potential there can't be overstated. But I think also, and this is where the cycle touring thing perhaps comes in more strongly, for me, travel by bicycle and spending time with bicycles and in places that you access by bicycle is a fantastic symbol of a very different model, if you like, of what quality of life looks like. And that's about quality of experience, about being in nature, engaging with people, seeing new communities, being on the road. So the bike for me kind of stands for a high quality, celebratory way of living, which has got very, very little to do with consuming lots of stuff and a lot to do with exploring the world, having great experiences, having quality of time. So for those two reasons, I think the bike is superbly kind of central to what Build Back Better really needs to look like.
That's a super answer, Kate, and I suspect you're preaching to a converted audience, but I wish everyone could hear that message. Isla, have you got anything to add to that?
I just agree with everything Kate said. Yeah, we're at a moment in time where something really awful has probably, or I hope has catalysed and accelerated the change that we've all been hoping for and trying to make happen for a very long time. And yeah, I think if we can seize this now, and speaking on behalf of the cycle industry, cycle industry has got to play our part in that, in making a lot of the changes that have started for people that haven't experienced cycling in the way so many of us have for many years. It's new to them, and making that stick. That's what I'm hoping for.
Yeah, and Julian, anything to add?
Yeah, I mean, very difficult to add anything to that. It's definitely a moment to try and refigure things. And I think especially around cars, I mean, so much of our way of life, whether it's in a town or in the countryside, has ended up mediated by the existence of the motor car, people commuting further, being sort of inactive as a result, and all the public health implications of that, whether you're sitting in a car with health implications of inactivity, or whether you're in a city, breathing polluted air, which is, it hires the risk of your susceptibility to diseases like COVID-19. So yeah, it's certainly a moment that makes apparent the need for change, and you can only hope that that's being taken as seriously as it needs to be in the right places.
And I think maybe to add to the thoughts there is that I think we've all experienced when we've been on the road and you're living out of a couple of panniers, you have this revelation, don't you? Like, oh, I'm really having a great time. I don't need as much stuff. And then you come home and look at my backdrop, you come home and your house is full of stuff and you suddenly think, oh, I don't need all of this stuff. So not only is the bike a fantastic way of enjoying life with less, but it really, really brings home that message that, wow, I am enjoying life with less. It's a real win-win there.
Absolutely. Well, thank you. I think that's a really good starting message. But I think, Julian, you just touched on it there. I think one of the tricky things is, we all, I suspect everyone listening in the audience agrees with this. How do we ensure that this change is lasting, and how do we achieve the macro level change? And Kate, it's something I think you're pretty sure that you're quite passionate about, the campaigning side of things. Like, what can we all be doing as cycle tourists to kind of help make these changes?
Whew, do you really, you really want me to get stuck in here? Well, yeah, I mean, I think there are many things that we can do. Number one, as I say, I think that as cycle tourists, we are living models of people who are clearly having a high quality of life, but in a different way from the standard model, which says you've got to earn shed loads of money and have shed loads of stuff and probably drive a big car and have a fancy watch and the best trainers and all of that stuff. So I think we're kind of living, breathing models of how to celebrate a high quality of life in a very different way. But I also think we need to be political. I mean, a lot of the changes that we need to make sure these shifts become long-term and stay with us and aren't just transient are political changes. I mean, it's governments that have to change transport infrastructure. You and I can't do that single-handedly just by cycling. We have to have different infrastructure if we're going to have safe, sustainable cycling in the long term, and that's government-led action. So I think we all need to be engaged in lobbying or, you know, in political activity, whatever form we're comfortable in doing that, whether that's writing to MPs or lobbying or marching or joining Extinction Rebellion or whatever it is. Political campaigning is key in all of this, absolutely key. And the same with the stuff. I mean, we have too much stuff. And the reason we have too much stuff is that we are, all of us, embedded with an economic system that cannot survive unless it grows. And we have to have a different system. And again, these are huge kind of political conversations which are going on. I mean, who's not heard of donut economics by now? I mean, donut economics is the latest thing, and it's all about living well within planetary boundaries. And governments all over the world are getting involved in donut economics. It's very, very, very exciting. The circular economy stuff that I'm sure Isla is going to talk about, it's all over the world that governments are getting excited about this. But again, we need to be politically active here, because this is big shifts we're talking about here to change economic structures and to change the values that are embedded in those economic structures and to move away from a growth-based, resource-ravenous model. Governments are timid. They need to know that we will back them up if they take this bold step. So yeah, we can be models of living a good life in a different way, but we have to get politically active to get the infrastructure, both transport and economic, to shift, so that these changes become long-term.
I'm interested in Isla's thoughts on this, because with your background, Isla, you've obviously been in business, both with Isla Bikes and previous to Isla Bikes. What role does business play in creating these macro shifts?
Again, a huge question. I wonder whether it's a point to talk about the Imagine project, because I think that will illustrate some of the challenges facing businesses. So the Imagine project is something that Isla Bikes started, I think it was around about 4 years ago, with the aim to ensure that families can continue to enjoy the benefits of cycling in future, but with more sustainably supplied bicycles. So looking at the bicycle itself, and taking the principles of the circular economy and endeavouring to try to apply those to bicycles. So just in case people aren't familiar with the circular economy concept, almost all of our goods that we use, consume, if you want to use that word, are supplied on a take, make and dispose model. So it's also known as a linear supply chain. So what that means is we take the raw materials out of the ground, or from wherever they come from, we make them in something that we use for a while, and then the product is usually thrown away. Sometimes there's a little bit of recycling applied to the stuff at the end of life, but very often it ends up in landfill, and so that's very wasteful and ultimately unsustainable. So the circular economy principle envisages that in future goods will be rented to the end user rather than sold. And the user will pay for the service the product provides rather than outright ownership. And once they finish using it, so in our case a bicycle, it would be returned to the factory where that ownership is retained, who would refurbish or remanufacture and send on to the next user. So those materials continue to circulate in use rather than end up so often in landfill, but also the product circulates. So that's why the name circular is applied to it, because there's two circular concepts. And the idea being that materials will move between industries, and waste from one industry might be a raw input for another, and so you've got that continuous cycle going on. So we started having a go at doing that, not as the main part of our business. The main part of our business then and has remained selling bikes in a linear way, in a linear, more wasteful way. But we wanted to see if it was possible with bikes, and we set about doing that. And there are all sorts of challenges to solve in doing that. So the technological aspects of the bicycle, so that we're using raw materials to make the bike that hadn't come out, weren't virgin raw materials, they'd come from another industry, recycled materials, making the bike last as long as possible and then make it separable at the end of life. And we ended up with a product that did that, or certainly the frame and forks were completely circular, and the parts, some of them more or less so. And we were renting those to families. But the really big challenge for businesses, to get to the start of the question you asked, Laura, is that to scale that from a very few users, you have to obviously make a lot of bikes up front, which eventually will end up going through one user and the next user and next user. And that scaling phase means there's a lot of manufacturing happening. And then at the end, you would actually just be servicing in the case of bicycles. Mm-hmm. The scaling part, you need to spend all the money to make the bike, and then you don't get paid for it at the point that it goes to the user. You get paid gradually over a period of time. So what you end up with is a huge cash flow hole, a big cash flow problem in order to scale it. And the faster you want to scale it, the bigger the size of that hole is. And what we discovered as a business, we recognized that up front, and we saved up a lot of money actually for a small business in order to be able to see us through that patch. But the manufacturing costs of the bicycle that we came up with were higher than we expected. And we simply, a year ago, just over a year ago, when we were at the point where we wanted to start doing more, we hadn't got enough money to get through that scaling phase. And my experience of as a business person in the circular economy is the cash flow thing is the elephant in the room. It's the bit I haven't read about anywhere else. I haven't seen any presentations or been to anything where the cash flow element has been talked about. And we tried to go this alone, and we learned a lot from it. And I do believe that we will still take our learnings forward in some way, or somebody else will in the future. And we essentially, in the short term, the project failed. Now there is money available through the EU to help businesses with this, but obviously that's not available to us anymore. But it's where we come back to really Kate's point, that the political side of things, that we need to have political will to endorse businesses, to help businesses like ours that really want to do the right thing for the environment, but we're stuck in this trap of shorter-term investment. And I think that may actually change, because what I am seeing is investor behaviour changing. So a typical investment cycle for a business of our size, so outside of investors, would be private equity. And they're looking to turn a business around and sell it on in 3 to 5 years at a substantial profit. And that time frame doesn't fit with the circular economy model, because it's not profitable soon enough. It's very profitable long term, but it's not profitable soon enough. But we're seeing in people that are investing money, so our pensions is the big one, but people are actually questioning where their money is being invested now. So the end investor, which anybody who's got a pension is, actually asking, well, where is my money going? And if you look at the list of a standard pension fund where it's been, probably most people here today wouldn't be very comfortable with a lot of the businesses that are on there. And so I do see, outside of governments, pressure coming from that end, and that pressure may well translate to approaches being made to business like mine, saying, look, we're a longer term investor, and can we help you make that transition, because our clients are saying they don't want their money being put into wasteful or environmentally damaging businesses. So that, I think that is a little glimmer on the horizon that we can perhaps look forward to in the future.
That's really good to hear, and that kind of, it comes back to Kate's point really, doesn't it, about it needs to be activism and political activism and campaigning on this kind of stuff to make that change, to make our voices collectively heard.
Yeah,
more
or just ask your pension advisor. You know, if you have that conversation, they're not going to change it there and then, but if enough people ask, that message gets back. And I think I agree with Kate about our whole growth, international growth economy. We need a change to that. We need a systemic change. But in the meantime, it may actually be that the capitalist pressure of the end investors saying, no, I don't want my money in those businesses, actually also helps get, so within the system that we've got, and I'm not endorsing it as a system, but I'm saying that there may be some actual market pressure that helps make this shift. In the meantime, I'm sensing that.
Let's hope.
Talk to. So yeah, but that's something that we can all do.
That's really interesting. We've had a question in which is kind of related to some of this stuff, which is about the protests in the 70s in the Netherlands, which the Stop Killing Children protest, I won't try and pronounce it in Dutch, which led to the change in cycling infrastructure in the Netherlands, which is why it's such an amazing place to cycle now. Have you got any thoughts about why the people of the Netherlands had such a strong reaction to increasing space to cars? And can we learn anything about that successful grassroots campaign here? Or do you think car culture is too ingrained in some countries, specifically here in the USA and Canada? So it's kind of, how do you mobilize people enough to make this kind of lasting change? Who would like to take that one?
Yeah,
I'm happy to. I've done quite a lot of cycle campaigning in London, and yeah, I mean, I think it's Kindermorten or something like that. I think but yeah, child killing. I think, you know, even the words itself, stop the killing of child killing, is very confronting, and I think actually that points to, yeah, a fundamental issue, as both Isla and Kate refer. I mean, there's politics at the bottom of all this, and it's there are so many people and institutions now making the very kind of worthy contribution of sort of like building this movement. For, you know, the values that everyone would like to live with and live by and in accordance with. And, you know, it's not unheard of to see the JP Morgans and the McKinseys of the world also talking about mental health and well-being. You know, these ideas are now becoming kind of common culture. It does make me think, though, of one of the leadership debates in 2019, and Jeremy Corbyn suggesting something about the 4-day working week. Because we need to live in a way that leaves us happier at the end of the week, and a sort of ripple of laughter that went across the audience. And that's kind of it's interesting there from Isla, we have a very strong business case, and I think Kate talking about the social cultural movement, but these kind of values really need to be kind of geared up and granted a kind of assertiveness. So I think that the Stop the Killing campaign for road safety in the Netherlands really points to, that gives it real political heft. So that, you know, it can't be ignored at the sort of highest levels of government, because, you know, what's the expression that, you know, power concedes nothing without a fight. So, you know, at some point you do have to kind of grasp that dynamic of the issue, I think.
It's also, I think the one of the often stated things about the Netherlands is that, oh, it's different there. It's not like here. We're different. Our culture is different. Our cities are laid out differently, so you can't get the cycle lanes in. If you look at the photographs of Amsterdam pre that campaign that started in the 1970s and that has prompted all the change that's happened since then, it does look like our cities. They're choked with cars, and the culture really wasn't that different. And I think using that difference as an excuse for us not to even try doesn't wash when you actually look at the facts relating to what happened in the Netherlands.
And it wasn't an overnight change either, was it, in the Netherlands? It took a sustained campaign for decades to get to the Netherlands to where they are now. And I think we have to take heart from that, don't we? Like, we're just starting in a way. And to go, but we can definitely get there. There's, as you say, the Netherlands has also got rain, and it's also got traffic,
and Copenhagen has snow as well in addition to the rain. It's yeah, I think there's actually something really profoundly dangerous about that kind of a historical sense of suggesting that, you know, good maternity rights just landed out of nowhere in Scandinavia, and good cycle infrastructure just landed out of nowhere in the Netherlands. And if we are kind of, you know, uprooted from the actual political processes that create these changes, then where does that leave us? You know, we're kind of relinquishing the kind of tools of the struggle that has to happen and just believing that these things are preordained elsewhere, which they're absolutely not.
So we will, I think we'll move on in a minute from this topic, because it's such a big one, and I think it's also something which is quite general and related to all types of cycling, isn't it? It's not specifically cycle touring. But I just wanted to, somebody's asked a question, which is there any cycling group focused solely on lobbying politicians to improve nationwide cycling in the UK? Liaising with schools in the UK, groups in the Netherlands, etc., etc. Now, Cycling UK, I know, does engage with this stuff, and they do have a campaigning officer. If anyone knows of anybody else, like any lobbying groups or so on, I know there's lots of regional ones. Perhaps you can pop them in the chat so that the person who's asked that question can see. But I would say if you join Cycling UK, that's a huge part of their remit. They're very proactive on stuff. Right, so perhaps we can just move, it's sort of related, but it's coming on the environment stuff really. It's a question for Kate specifically, this one, which is that we're talking, you mentioned before, you know, the climate emergency and carbon reduction, but what other environmental issues should we be considering with cycling and cycle touring in particular?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a really important question, because we've more or less got our heads around the fact that there is a climate emergency now, but very few people have heard of the ecological emergency. And some scientists are arguing that, you know, the degradation of ecosystems and the loss of species, which, as I said earlier, is our life support system. Some scientists are arguing that that is every bit as threatening to us as a species, actually, as climate change. But I mean, bless David Attenborough, where would we be without him? But other than David Attenborough and his kind of recent stuff about extinction, we really haven't heard so much about the ecological crisis. So when I went to South America, there were three big things I tried to do to make my journey more sustainable, or anyway less impactful. I rode a bamboo bike rather than a steel or a carbon one. I crossed the Atlantic on a cargo ship rather than flew, and I ate vegetarian the whole way. And then I gave that information to Mike Berners-Lee, who's a kind of a big carbon and ecological analyst of this kind of thing. Guess which one had the biggest reduction of my negative impacts? By far, it was eating vegetarian. And that's because, you know, industrial agriculture is the biggest driver of both climate change and also ecological devastation. And that's something I think we don't always think about as cycle tourists when we're on the road. Actually, the energy that we're putting into ourselves to power our journey is every bit as significant as what we've made the bike out of, or how we've made the bike, or how we've traveled to the beginning of the journey. So that's an issue I'd really, really like. Right. I mean, I'm vegetarian anyway, so I wasn't about to be eating meat. But if we are meat eaters, and I still eat dairy, if we can reduce the meat and the dairy input in our food, that has a huge, huge impact in terms of our ecological footprint. And also our carbon footprint. So I think that's a really important point that gets neglected.
Absolutely, thank you. Thanks, Kate. Okay, so moving on slightly. Kate, someone just asked about your website in the chat. Perhaps you want to just pop your details of your website in the chat window so that people can find you online. It's kind of related to this, is that people talk about leaving only footprints. So this is specifically related to going on a cycle tour, and you can interpret it as you will, but people talk about leave only footprints. It's a little bit trite, if I'm honest, as that phrase, and I think people use it without necessarily unpacking what it means. But can you guys on the panel talk about what that might mean? To me, inevitably, when you travel through an area, you are going to make an impact, positive or negative. How can you make sure that the impact that you do have by taking a cycle tour is as positive as possible? And that might be the impact that you have on the place that you visit. It might be the impact that you have sort of big picture by buying a bike and buying panniers, etc., etc. But yeah, the short question is, how do you make sure that when you leave footprints, they are positive footprints? Who would like to take that question first?
I don't mind taking it. I mean, I think it's a really interesting one, because I think there are two ends of the spectrum here, and there's, you know, the leave no trace school of thought is, you know, absolutely the one to follow when clearing up your campsite at the side of the road or in the forest or wherever it might be. And then at the other end of the spectrum, the idea of, well, I am here and there is a footprint of that, and I have this journey will have an impact on myself and on those that I interact with, and you know, taken to an extreme, I think that logic can probably leave you quite, you know, self-important and colonial, with the idea of, you know, where there's this great significance to your setting foot somewhere, and I think, as with all things, the answer is probably somewhere in the middle, kind of thing, and you know, there's a great way of interacting with your environment and surroundings and the people that you're amongst, when you're traveling on the road, and you know, you might be eating in small local roadside restaurants where, you know, you're away from the cities and the sort of more corporate outlets, so you're providing kind of valuable economic support. You're maybe in an area where people don't necessarily encounter Westerners, don't necessarily encounter white people, you know, and there's kind of, you know, there might be negative projections put out about that kind of type in the world. You know, we're from rich countries with wealthy, powerful passports, and actually having like real world engagements that help to go beyond the stereotypes. And obviously vice versa as well, in that we often see the world's population or people in the less important areas just depicted through stereotypes. And I think actually having real encounters there and embracing them as the learning experience that they are is really enriching and valuable for everyone, really.
Isla or Kate, anything to add?
Yeah, I'm happy to jump in a little bit about the bicycle. It's back to materials really, but just thinking about your equipment, the most sustainable bicycle is the one that you make last as long as possible. So not having a new bike because it's got an extra gear, just making do with the one that you've got. You can't really do better than that. Yeah. And if you're thinking around materials, carbon's not great, although there are some composite materials that are being developed that are much lower impact. And steel is a really good material just because of its longevity again, and it's very, very long fatigue life. So those are just two things if you are thinking about your bicycle, just bear in mind.
And I think that's a super important point, and the same goes for all your stuff, right? I mean, if you turn up covered in shiny new panniers and shiny new everything, then that sends out a very different message. And if you turn up with stuff that's obviously used and reused, and yeah, making your stuff last as long as possible is the most important thing, rather than what it's made of. I really, really agree.
It's really interesting, isn't it? Because something you hear a lot in the cycling communities is N+1. But actually, that this message is the exact opposite. It's N. Stick with N, which is a hard message to swallow.
N+1 in relation to bicycles is a whole different thing, and then in relation to Land Rover Jaguars or something. Let's get this into perspective. The bike is a good thing, right? It's a low impact, relatively low embodied energy machine that's fabulously efficient. I once read somewhere, I've never been able to find this since, but I definitely once read that on a flat road without a headwind, if such a thing exists, a cyclist can do 10 miles per peanut, and it's the most efficient way of moving a human being that has ever been invented. So I love that idea, 10 miles per peanut. So don't let's lose sight of how fabulous the bicycle is. Okay, we maybe don't need 10 of them, but 10 bikes is a heck of a lot better than 10 cars, is my point.
That's probably good news to the bike manufacturers sat on the panel.
Yeah, and also for those of us who have 10 bikes.
Multiple bikes, absolutely, yeah. Don't tell you how many bikes are in the garage. So something that's quite a general question then, and it's something that I know that Julian and Kate have talked about at length, is how we can use a cycling trip to promote a wider message. So both of you have used cycle journeys to tell a wider story. How do you do that in a way that isn't gimmicky or tokenistic?
Ooh, who wants to go first?
You go, Kate.
Okay, so So for me, I think it's a really good question, and you do see trips that are, well, the ones that drive me really nuts are the ones that are really high impact, and then there's a bit tagged on at the end. But we offset our trip, and we gave a talk about X, Y, and Z, and we raised £10.50 for the local school or something. I mean, that sort of stuff drives me nuts. What I think is important is what the trip is fundamentally about. I mean, so my last two big journeys have fundamentally about trying to explore a big issue and raise awareness of a big issue, and using the bike as a way of doing that. And I think that that's very different if your whole trip is kind of built around that concept than if you go do a trip you want to do anyway and then just tag something on at the end. And I also think you have to walk the talk. So I really think that if we widen that from cycle tourism to the world of adventure and adventure travel, there's a huge kind of elephant in the room, which is the impact of adventure travel on the world that we love to adventure in, and it just doesn't get discussed enough. So I think you have to really think about what's the values and the goals behind your journey, and also what's the impact of it, and are you being honest about that? Like, how does the cost benefit analysis work out? Julian, what would you say?
Yeah, no, I mean, I think that's it. I think one of the things that's very kind of immediately of me off-putting, and is kind of almost a sign of something that, you know, maybe lacks sincere impact or even having seriously thought through where it's coming from, is the tendency to sort of overpromise. You know, the idea that even something as, you know, wonderful, and of course we all agree is wonderful and transformative as a long bike ride, as cycling around the world, you know, you're having an individually fantastically transformative experience, but it's kind of a lot to suggest that this is globally transformative. And I think, you know, when I broke my world record going around the world, it was called "This is not for charity," you know, and it wasn't. I mean, I find charity a problematic issue in itself, and actually, if we look at, you know, the Northern European countries, they have very, very low rates of charitable giving, but kind of generally much better well-being outcomes. You look at the United States, where you have astronomically high charitable giving, often kind of linked to sort of tax rebates, and you have horrendously bad social outcomes in terms of health and well-being. So I think that idea of, you know, you put something in and you get something out, often monetary, which is a very capitalist logic, is kind of, can be part of the problem. I think, yeah, beyond that, I mean, my ride in Palestine, I found, you know, I think there's a value to that, as with previously cycling through Uyghur in northwest China. You know, you're going somewhere that people don't often go to, and it gives you a sort of deeper, granular level of insight or relatability when places are in the news, and I think that's very valuable. Or as Kate said, I mean, of course, I absolutely applaud and couldn't speak highly enough of Kate's rides, but, you know, there's a sort of systemic kind of totality that she's engaging. When I'm not going to fly to the beginning of my journey, I am going to do it on a bamboo bicycle. And so that kind of, you know, it ceases to be kind of over-promising at that point, because it's saying, okay, this is a complex system, there's no easy answer, but I'm really going to try hard to grapple with it at kind of like multiple elements of my journey, rather than in the simplistic kind of ride a bike, change the world, give to charity, change the world, which again, you know, it's insufficient for actually changing the world most often.
As are most, to be fair, aren't they? I mean, none of us are single-handedly going to change the world, and I think none of us would want to downplay the value of just going for a bike ride either. But I think if you want to use your bike ride to try to change the world, do it wholeheartedly. really think about all aspects of it, and embed that in the core of what you're doing, and enjoy it. There's nothing worse than somebody trying to change the world and who's constantly depressed. It's really off-putting. We have to.
Not a good advert for changing the world at the end of the day.
Celebratory world changes, yeah.
I'd just like to add, on behalf of all the people that go out on their bikes to get away from people and don't want to be out doing it as a thing, they just want to be in that moment. I think we're still doing our bit. I think by the act of just riding our bikes to the shops or riding our bikes on holiday for pleasure, we're role modeling an alternative way of living. just by being on the bicycle, and that if for those of us that is all we feel able to do, then that's enough.
Absolutely. I mean, it's really important not to lose sight of that, isn't it? You don't have to be doing something bigger than yourself. And I think actually that comes back to Julian's point, right? With your, I don't want to speak for you, Julian, but with your, this is not for charity. Like, you don't have to do a massive bike ride, which actually is probably a lot about something you're doing for yourself, and say that you're doing it for charity or whatever. Like, just be honest about your motivations.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, you know, and these big rides, often there's all manner of kind of class implications to that. They're, you know, often very expensive to you know, to put together, to fund. I mean, I managed to go around the world on a sort of budget I'd scrimped together as a courier of €10 a day, just about. You know, the record that has since been retaken required a sort of budget and a support team of £500,000. So really what you're testing isn't even anyone cycling. It's first and foremost, you're testing someone's ability to fund £500,000, which is obviously, you know, somewhat exclusive at the outset. So yeah, and as Isla says, I mean, it's vote with your feet, vote with your bike. It's, you know, it's you're making the change, and that kind of, you know, granular daily engagement with the system, saying we can do it differently, I can get to work differently, is so important.
Sure. So somebody's asked an interesting question, which is, how do you reconcile the privilege of cycle touring as a white person? And I'm really conscious that this panel is a white panel, but how do you reconcile the privilege of cycle touring as a white person outside of the global north? And how do you think of the history and the legacy that you cycle through? I don't know if perhaps, Julian, you want to take that one first, given your experience talking about Palestine yesterday, but go for it.
Yeah, I mean, it's a really good one to be conscious of, and there's definitely, you know, the sort of the great white savior complex is you know, is very off-putting to everyone. At the same time, I mean, I guess I don't know. It's hard to speak to. Yeah, I'm a white person, but I think a lot of the discourse that we do have on the internet, we are also people, and that's not to say that white privilege isn't an issue. It absolutely is. But I think when you know, we talked about showing up with sort of an old bicycle and beaten up pannier bags, as compared to arriving in a shiny 4x4. By and large, I've never really arrived at any roadside anywhere in the world and not been kind of welcomed in. You know, or, you know, been treated as another customer at a restaurant, or welcomed into someone's yurt in northwest China to get out of a hailstorm, kind of thing. So I do think there's something leveling about the bicycle, that because it's not an ostentatious form of travel, you know, people will often see you as, you know, inherently quite humble. Maybe they'll assume that you're actually very, very poor. Certainly in the United States, anyone that meets you traveling on a bicycle generally thinks you're a homeless person. You know, the police are constantly stopping you to see what, you know, if you have papers in order and stuff like that. So it's always something to be aware of. I mean, traveling through Kazakhstan and northwest China or Turkey, Palestine, I mean, I'm not even sort of strongly identifying as Muslim, but it's kind of part of my heritage and my background. And it's kind of that kind of the kinship that I felt sort of, you know, we're in South Thailand hearing the call to prayer sort of stuff. And you know, so there are, you know, we are all humans, you know, we are a community of people. And I think the bicycle itself actually comes with these kind of connotations of the sort of person that rides a bicycle, or, you know, someone used to ride a bicycle as a child, someone's children are currently learning to ride a bicycle. So I do think there's something that kind of equalizes people and that opens positive exchange. And I do think it's important to engage issues of race, absolutely. But we can't treat them as if they're insurmountable, because essentially this entire discourse of race is necessitated by the instance of horrendous inequality and prejudice over the centuries, and in order to sort of dismantle that, we can't see them as immutable, you know. That's how, in my personal opinion, we kind of struggle to overcome them with luck, inshallah.
I think that's a really important point, and I think there's also a very simple point to be made about just being aware of our privilege. I mean, yes, it's completely different to rock up on a bike than in a car. And I've had similar experience rocking up in a sea kayak as opposed to a yacht. You know, if you come on, arrive on an island in a small boat, you get treated utterly differently. You arrive in a yacht, which I've only done once, but there's an assumption that you're rich, and it's, yeah, it's startling how different the treatment is. But anyway, so I totally accept that point, but I also think there is a thing about simply having a passport. I had an issue a little incident in Colombia where I'd just stopped by a roadside stall to buy some water or something, some food. And the young woman that was running the roadside stall wanted to see my passport. And it was slightly embarrassing because I was carrying it in a waistband and it was always mangy and sweaty. But I had recently lost my passport and I was petrified of losing it again because I'm on my final warning with passports. But anyway, so I dug it out and it was this kind of mangy, sweaty thing that I handed over to this young woman. And she was just so excited to see a passport. And of course, it occurred to me afterwards, well, she almost certainly didn't have one and would never get one, and was highly unlikely to leave that area of Colombia, let alone the country. And it really, I mean, we all know this, but those incidents really bring it home, don't you? It's a huge privilege just to have a passport and just to be able to travel. And I think just staying aware of that is an important and valuable thing just in itself.
Absolutely, I would agree with that. So we've had a couple of questions which are about inclusivity. It's hard to try and encapsulate them all into a single question, but it's really the idea that for many of us, particularly those of us on the panel, we do all have passports. It's relatively easy for us to jump on a bike and go off on a trip. We had an event yesterday from Gears for Queers, which I know, Kate, you've interviewed them before, and they threw up loads of really interesting perspectives about disability and homophobia in certain countries, and how there are lots of barriers to travel, which a lot of us perhaps don't experience or don't think about. And I wondered if you've got anything to say about that, to make sure that one of the questions is, if traveling is a relative cakewalk for lots of us, you then feel entitled to it. And you know, is that okay, or have you got any comments on that? It's a bit of a garbled question. Hopefully you can make something of it.
Oh, it's a big one, isn't it? Yeah.
I suppose it's that, how do we make sure that cycle travel and post-COVID world is as inclusive as possible? I don't know if it's something that, Isla, you consider when you're designing bikes, for example. I know you've done the range of bikes for older people to make sure that cycling is something that can carry on comfortably into older age. Are there any other examples of that kind of thing going on?
Yes, yeah, and I think business confidentiality means I can't really speak about the exact examples now, but that's something that is very close to our values at Isla Bikes. And inclusivity in cycling, we're not inclusive. It's not inclusive as a competitive sport. It's not inclusive as a social activity, very often within the cycling clubs in Britain, and it's not inclusive in terms of product. So we have product that's gender specified, as in we have the women's product, and then we have the product, and the product is unisex, which is designed for men, and it's that kind of thing. It's that shallow thinking, I think, that goes across everything to do with cycling in Britain. And so, yeah, that is something that we're looking to address, and our range of bicycles for elderly people is one example of that. Not here to talk about our product, but it's there's the needs of a huge group of people who want to cycle and are able to cycle are not met through the product that's available now. And that actually also would extend to people of all ages with restricted mobility, for example. So yeah, there's a big job for the industry to do, and there are other groups of people that are unrepresented in product as well at the moment, and that's something that we're looking at and working on at the moment behind the scenes.
And I think there's a huge job to be done socially as well, isn't there? I mean, I was one of many people that was horrified at some of the comments that Cycling UK got when they tried to engage with the Black Lives Matter campaign and tried to look at the cycling industry from that lens, and were shocked to discover how white it is, and then opened a discussion on the Cycling UK platform. Okay, guys, what are we going to do about this? And the backlash they got really, really shocked me. Like, people were saying, I've just resigned, I don't think this is an issue for cycling, and I'm not interested in this, and I just want to ride my bike and eat cake and drink coffee, and don't drag me into this kind of politics. So I think there's a huge issue about inclusivity that is both to do with the social norms and values of the organisations that we're part of, and to do with cycling infrastructure. And
that's back to the first point in this this bit of the discussion, wasn't it? That's a failure to recognise privilege, and that's the the starting point for all of us is to recognise our privilege and sense check ourselves against it frequently.
Yeah, I looked briefly in the Q&A panel earlier and could see someone asking about ableism and disability, and of course, almost by definition, and as Isla suggests, a lot of the design is essentially biased and built around able-bodied people, as often, unfortunately, as the ability to just, your only problems are your logistics of how you fly your bicycle or you ship your bicycle to where you're going to start riding. And I do think it's encouraging, actually, in the urban cycling scene, you're seeing increasing kind of activity around the fact that, pro-bicycle, pro-person infrastructure will often make better conditions for people who are navigating cities in wheelchairs, say. I mean, I love it when I see people pointing out that a bicycle is not necessarily an upright machine. As the recumbent lot would say, it's not wrong. But, an upright machine, but a hand cycle, it might be someone in a chair on a hand cycle making use of cycling infrastructure. And I think it's great that these voices are coming into the discourse and are challenging and changing what cycling as it stands is assumed to be. And yeah, I wasn't aware of that with the Cycling UK and Black Lives Matter. And it's a shame, because actually in my experience, cyclists are often kind of more progressive, kind of non-conformist types. I mean, the road network inherently does not really favour us. We are statistically deviant from the sort of majority transport form. And I do think that actually often makes people sort of better able to see the biases in other forms of life as well, other sort of advantages or disadvantages that we live with. And I think it's about elevating the positive examples and recognising one's own privileges and elevating those who are having to struggle against prejudices that we maybe aren't having to face ourselves.
I think the other big prejudice as well is around economic privilege. And for a lot of people, we've got all of our infrastructure designed around cars, but for a lot of people that's not even an option. So it's not about choice, it's about options. And so there's a social justice issue around our prioritisation of the motor car in our transport planning.
Absolutely, and that was really brought to the fore during the pandemic, wasn't it? When the government was saying don't use public transport, but if you don't have access to a car, then what you're supposed to do? How do you get to work? And it just didn't. It was completely ignored.
Absolutely. I mean, and this is also why the politics element is unavoidable on every level. You can't flood a society with plastic packaging and plastic products and then have an anti-plastic campaign. You cannot flood a society with confectionery and refined sugars and processed foods and a built infrastructure that does not favour walking and cycling and then bemoan obesity. We have public officials with public responsibilities, and then the actual responsibility for change, it can't really just be outsourced on individuals to be the change in an environment that's built against the outcome that you profess to desire, sort of thing.
Yeah.
Somebody just put in the chat the comment that a lot of cycle lanes have barriers in which are to prevent motorbikes, but actually that prevents a lot of other types of bicycle as well. I know it's something that we find a lot towing a kid's trailer behind us, is that a lot of bike lanes we just can't use, which is planning issues. Anyway, slight change of tack. So I'm going to just throw a scenario at you, and I would like to hear your views on this one. It's something which has come up again and again at the Cyclotouring Festival, the idea that you're cycling in a country which perhaps is in the global south or somewhere which is not, it's like in a poorer country than the one you're from, and you get taken home by somebody, and once you're in their house you realise quite quickly that they're going to feed you, give you a bed for the night. It's quite apparent that they don't have very much to give, but they're being super hospitable, and every cycle tourist knows that the world treats its cyclists very kindly in other parts of the world. What do you do? Like, how do you deal with that situation where it would be quite obviously rude to give them cash, and you try and give them cash and they don't accept it? I'm sure that some or all of you have had this kind of situation. How have you dealt with it?
Yeah, it's a really tough one, isn't it? And I think we have to think about it, because there are so many more of us now doing long distance cycling in these parts of the world. There's so many of us privileged people. It's no longer a rare thing, is it, for a country to have lots and lots of cycle tourists appearing at its doors? And I think we have to think about it as a systemic issue. But personally, I try to avoid the situation. I'm actually quite unsociable when I'm cycling, and I really prefer spending the night in my tent, because I'm exhausted by the evening, and trying to kind of socialize and deal with people in a different line. This is going to sound terrible, isn't it? But I actually find it much more relaxing to be in my tent. So I personally prefer to be there anyway. And if I do end up in a situation where I'm staying the night with somebody, then I always try to carry stuff with me that I can leave as a gift that might actually be useful. And obviously there's a limit to how much stuff you can have in your pannier if you're on a long distance trip, but I do try to think of what I might be able to offer as some kind of non-monetary exchange if I'm in that kind of situation, whether it's, you know, pictures of where I live at home, or stuff that the kids might be able to use, like pencils and paper and books and that kind of thing. But I think it's a really hard one, and I think it's no longer okay just to say, well, people like to be generous and we should just accept it, because I think there are so many of us now encountering that kind of situation that we have to think harder about what that differential actually means between that person that's got virtually nothing and where we are. But I don't feel like I have any really good answers. Maybe Julian has more answers.
Yeah, I've got a couple of thoughts on it. I mean, I think always being grateful is obviously imperative, and always like reading a situation is also essential. I mean, my go-to answer on this is that actually it can be potentially someone poor or otherwise extending hospitality. I kind of would worry that there is a chance of kind of, you know, denying someone the dignity or the right or the opportunity to extend a warm welcome, which, you know, which is beautiful and human. And I wouldn't necessarily assume that someone was going beyond their means in doing so, by and large. You know, I've kind of drank camel's milks with guys on the Kazakh steppe, and I think they were just making an offering of something that they had and they enjoyed sharing it together. Or likewise, the first time cycling in Turkey and buying one simit from a baker, which is like a Turkish pretzel covered in sesame seeds, delicious. Buying one and sitting outside to eat it, and the baker's assistant coming out and giving me two more. I don't think no one was really out of pocket by that. And I think it's a really important and a special thing and a nice thing to share in, and it could be problematic to try too hard to deny these moments. Then the absolute opposite extreme, which kind of a couple of years ago I wouldn't have said, but in more recent times, and actually last year I was in Istanbul, which is a city that you often get touring cyclists arriving into. I mean, I've been one of those cyclists, and on this occasion I wasn't. But sitting at a cafe, and kind of a young lad from Switzerland covered in Ortliebs all over his bicycle rode in, and as has often and always been done for me, I got him his coffee and I bought him some food, and we had a bit of a chat. But something that was a bit unsettling and unfortunate was the extent to which I think he expected that kind of hospitality, and I think this might in some ways be a product of the internet, where people kind of share their best and their most heartwarming stories. You know, often you kind of don't necessarily unpack the less fortunate or the more complicated ones online and for your public audience. So the extent to which he just sort of like took it as a given that I was going to pay for his dinner was quite funny in this instance, but I could absolutely see how that would be really heavily problematic.
Absolutely, that's a really good. I think both of those are excellent points, Julian. I think the first one in particular, where hospitality is such an integral part of a culture. Like, what right do we have to say, "Oh, you stop being hospitable"? It's, yeah, don't treat me so well. Yeah, good. It's a good perspective. And there's lots of people who've been adding things in the chat about how they've dealt with it as well, which is interesting to see. So another sort of fairly quick fire one is, if you've got any thoughts on touring in countries with questionable human rights records. So Julian, I think you're the obvious. Someone had commented this in your talk yesterday about, like, feeling very uncomfortable about traveling in Israel during the occupation of Palestine. So I'll leave you to sort of start off with that one.
Yeah, I mean, again, I think you do have to travel through Israel to get to Palestine, but obviously, so by definition, you're going to sort of land into Israel and stuff. But the only way to get to Palestine is to go through Israel, and it's not to say you can't even have a positive engagement with Israeli society, like holding true to sort of anti-racist positions on the rights of Palestinians. And then obviously you go to Palestine and you have a greatly enriching experience, and you meet the local cyclists and speak to people, and you gain an enriching experience for sure. So I do think that we're at a point with the apartheid in Palestine where some kind of boycott principle and movement is very necessary, but at the same time there's types of engagement, and it's complicated, but engagement is an issue and is important. I mean, for the human rights issue, I mean, I've cycled in China, including in Uyghur, and that is how I would have gotten a relatability to Uyghur people that now means something when I see it on the news. Iran was the other example I saw put out. I mean, I've never cycled in Iran. I would really dearly love to. Some good friends have, I think Laura included. And often again, you're putting, you're traveling off the beaten track on a bicycle. Often you're putting money into sort of local hands, local pockets, small businesses. You're gaining an experience of a culture that helps you transcend and navigate a media and a news environment that is almost always hostile, and actually has a real paucity of information. And then also, I mean, human rights, it's kind of, when we talk about don't travel or don't go cycle touring in countries with poor human rights records, I mean, that would sort of necessitate not cycling around the British coast. I mean, it's British bombs that have destroyed Yemen, and, it's British kind of security and surveillance apparatus and police training methods that keep Shia protesters in Bahrain under a military dictatorship. So, I mean, human rights are used in a deeply sinister and malicious way, and leveraged to sort of demonize the countries that we don't like and that we have difficulties with, whilst the Saudis, the Emiratis, the Bahrainians, at the United States and the United Kingdom. I mean, the United States Army is the world's biggest emitter of carbon dioxide, for example, if we're going to do it in climate change terms. And it's vitally important that human rights don't get leveraged to sort of simply shut down countries with governments that we have disagreements with, and then get sidelined with those countries that we either belong to or are happy doing business with.
Yeah, and I think there's a point about perspective here too, isn't there? I mean, if I don't go to China, China's not really going to be, well, China's not going to notice, right? But if I went to China and wrote about some of this stuff and talked about it and bore witness, then that might have a tiny impact, and is more likely to have an impact than just not going. So for me, I think there is something about bearing witness and being there. And as you say, Julian, kind of having some kind of engagement with the people and the issues from your own ground level experience, that's really super important, and much more important than some kind of meaningless boycott by just not going in the first place.
I think that's a really good perspective on things. Thank you for that input. So we have got a few more questions that have come in. I'm conscious of the time; it's 4:05, and we are scheduled in for an hour. Panelists, are you okay for another 5-10 minutes? Just to answer, yeah, great. So it's a question really that I'm gonna aim at Isla, which is that in the US, companies like René Hurst are trying to lead an all-road bike revolution. Bikes which will run on most surfaces well, using repairable steel frames, wide tyres to allow running on gravel, tarmac, light mud, etc. And I know that Dan Joyce of Cycling UK has done talks at the festival in the past about one bike for everything. And actually, are we coming back to a situation where we can just have one bike for everything? But how, at the moment, it comes back to N+1 really, but how do we move the UK market from a bike for every surface to a single high quality bike?
I think the industry is moving that way. I think that we've almost come full circle with this, and I'm a big endorser of one bike for everything, and a hypocrite because you don't want to look in my garage. But I think it's very possible. What I'm really excited about that has happened within the industry over the last 10, 15 years is particularly around road bikes or drop bar bikes. The design of them for decades has been informed by racing and professional racing for men, the Tour de France, in terms of gear ratios and tyre width and clearance, tyre clearance. So you buy that sort of bike, you're stuck with narrow tyres and no mud guards, and that you can't. There's nothing you can do to adapt that. And I think the move away for road bikes into making bigger tyre clearances, lower gears, and making them not for racing, makes them more versatile inherently. And I think that's a really exciting change that's taken a long time to come along. But my view with bikes for specific surfaces is the best bike is the one that you've already got. And as long as it's got room for something that's a bit wider than a 23 or a 25C tyre, you can pretty much ride any bike anywhere, with the exception of really extreme mountain biking trails. And I do, and I frequently end up, I have got a lot of different bikes for different types of cycling, you might say different surfaces, but it's quite frequent that I go out on one and then see something else and think, oh, I wonder what's down there, and end up on what's deemed to be a completely unsuitable bike for that particular type of cycling, and it turns out to be just fine. So yeah, I think it's very possible. But to take the one bike to the extreme, I remember Dan Joyce's article for Cycling UK around that. And if you do want to have one bike for anything, you can make it even more versatile by just having two pairs of wheels. So you have a pair of wheels set up with road tyres and a pair of wheels set up with your particular choice of a fatter treaded tyre, and you can do pretty much anything then. On that sort of bike, just with a very quick wheel change, and it saves a lot of garage space.
You did a really good talk for us this year about adapting any bike for cycle touring. Really from the starting point that at the moment there's been such demand for bikes over the last 12 months that it's taking a long time to get your orders through. So look in your garage and see what you've got already, or look on Gumtree and get something secondhand and then just adapt it. And it was a really good kind of unintentionally ethical environmental sustainability message.
Yeah, I completely endorse that, and that's what I mean about the best bike you've got is the one the best bike for any job is the one you've already got. And just get out there and ride. Yeah, and you can, even if you haven't got low enough gears, you can always get off and walk.
Yeah, we won't ask you how many bikes you've got in your garage either.
No, please don't.
So I'm just going to flick through the questions. I think there are a couple more. There's some specifically about veganism. I don't know, Kate, if you, we're going back to the beginning of the discussion, but just to tick these ones off, if you want to talk about veganism, do you think eating vegan has the same impact if you don't eat local? So if you jackfruit burgers and lots of avocado on toast? I don't know if you want to talk about sort of, I mean, it's not specifically a cycling question, but it's one that I think some people.
Yeah, it's a really good question. I mean, and the whole thing about diet and carbon footprint is really complicated, but in general, eating vegan or vegetarian or cutting down on meat and dairy is a really positive thing to do from a climate change perspective and also from an ecological perspective. And one of the reasons why it might be better to eat more vegan, even if some of your food has come from elsewhere, is that the biggest problem with dairy and with meat is not necessarily the footprint involved in the travel, but it's to do with the methane produced by basically animals that burp, which are animals with more than one stomach. So if you're eating ruminant products like a sheep or lamb, or if you're drinking milk, then you're responsible for a lot of methane burps, basically. And it's the methane burps that have as big an impact as how far the milk has traveled to get to you. Did that kind of make sense? Anyway, so it's important to reduce your dairy and meat content, even if the thing you eat instead has come from further away. And if that thing that has come from further away has come to you on a boat, then actually it'll probably be a win overall, because boats, even cargo ships, have a lower footprint than flying. So it's a complicated thing, but in general, it's really good to reduce your meat and and dairy if you possibly can. And of course, if you can do that and eat local, then that's the best. Well, the best is to reduce your meat and dairy, eat local, and if you are eating any animal products, make sure it's organic and has a really high kind of quality of life, because that's the other side of things that doesn't get discussed so much, I think, is how terrible the lives of some of the animals that we eat are. Another big dark thing in a cupboard we could explore at some point, but yeah, reducing it is fantastically important, and has a win-win from a health point of view as well.
Right. I think it's 4:10 and we were scheduled in for an hour, and we've got the final talk was at 8 o'clock, so I will have to go and prepare for that. But I think we'll leave it there. There are some other questions. I think a lot of the other questions kind of repeat some of the things we've talked about. So apologies if your question hasn't been answered, but I'm sure the panelists wouldn't mind you emailing them. Is that fair? If you have specific questions?
Yeah, absolutely.
Great. And I'm really thankful to all three of you for joining us this evening. This afternoon. It was really good to kind of explore some of these issues with such erudite and eloquent speakers. Thank you so much. If you've got anything else to add, do you want anything else to add? Any final words from any of you? No pressure.
Just that, let's not forget how fantastic bikes are. I mean, yeah.
Get on your bike, go for a ride now.
On a positive, like whatever we're eating, wherever we're going, whatever we're cycling, being on a bike is a much, much better thing than most of the alternatives. And there are so many aspects about it that are really positive that I think that's where we should end. Bikes are great, and bike touring is the future.
Absolutely, that's a perfect ending, Kate. Thank you very much, and thanks to everyone for joining us. Final festival session is at 8 o'clock tonight with Timmy Mallet. He's a cycle tourist. He rode an e-bike to Santiago on the Camino de Santiago and back, drawing pictures and painting pictures on the way using an easel on the back of his bike. As an accomplished artist in his own right now. Oh. And his story is actually really interesting. I've just finished his book, so if you're at all curious, I would suggest you tune in at 8 o'clock, because it's genuinely a good story. I think he's going to tell us. So hopefully see some of you there. All right, everybody, thanks a lot. Enjoy the rest of the afternoon. Hopefully you've got enough daylight left to get out on your bike for a bit.
And thank you, Laura.
Thank
no worries. Take care. Bye.
Thanks for having me. Bye.